I've been a trucker for 20 years, and in that time, I've seen a lot of strange things on the road. Long hours, late nights, and empty highways can play tricks on your mind. But nothing compares to what happened one night when I was hauling a load through the Arizona desert. It still keeps me up at night. The night started like any other. I stopped at a small truck stop just outside Flagstaff to grab some coffee and stretch my legs. The desert sky was painted a deep red as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the landscape bathed in twilight. I liked driving at night. Fewer cars, fewer distractions. As I was about to head back to my truck, a man approached me. He looked odd, tall, thin, with hollow eyes, and a face that seemed almost too pale, like he hadn't been outside in years. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his coat, and when he spoke, his voice was low and raspy. "Hey, you heading west?" he asked. I hesitated but nodded. "Yeah, why?" He glanced around nervously as if making sure no one was listening. "If you're taking Route 66, listen to me. Whatever you do, don't stop at mile marker 203. No matter what you see, keep driving." I frowned, confused and slightly irritated. "What are you talking about?" But he didn't answer. He just turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the parking lot. I shook my head and climbed back into my truck, dismissing him as some crazy local. Truckers hear all kinds of weird stories, and I wasn't about to let a stranger get into my head. The desert was pitch black as I pulled back onto the highway. My headlights cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the endless stretch of road and the occasional cactus. The truck hummed steadily as I cruised along, but the man's words kept nagging at the back of my mind. "Don't stop at mile marker 203. It was ridiculous, I told myself, just some superstitious nonsense. A few hours later, the radio started acting up. Static crackled through the speakers, and faint, garbled voices seemed to whisper beneath the noise. I reached over to switch it off, but just as my fingers touched the dial, a voice came through the static, soft, distant, and unmistakably a woman's voice. "Please, help, ma'am." I froze, staring at the radio. The voice was so faint I thought I might have imagined it. Then it came again, louder this time. "Please stop, I need help." Gripping the wheel tighter, I leaned forward and spoke into the mic. "Hello? Who's out there? Do you need help?" There was no response, just more static. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself it was probably just interference. Maybe someone on another frequency was messing around, or maybe it was a glitch. Still, something about that voice unsettled me. It sounded wrong. As I drove on, I kept my eyes on the mile markers along the side of the road. When I passed 200, my heart began to race. A few minutes later, I saw it, mile marker 203. The metal sign stood on the shoulder, barely illuminated by my headlights. And then I saw her. A woman stood by the side of the road, waving. She was wearing a white dress, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders. Her skin was pale, almost glowing in the darkness. She looked scared, lost, and fragile. "Help me," she called, her voice the same one I'd heard on the radio. I slowed down, my instincts screaming at me to stop. But the man's warning echoed in my mind. "Don't stop at mile marker 203. The woman stepped closer to the road, her arms outstretched. "Please don't leave me here," she cried. I hesitated, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Something about her didn't feel right. Her movements were stiff, almost mechanical, and her eyes didn't seem to focus on me. It was like she was staring through me, but I couldn't just drive away. What if she really needed help? Against my better judgment, I pulled over and rolled down the passenger window. "Are you okay?" I asked. She nodded quickly, tears streaming down her face. "My car broke down a few miles back. I've been walking for hours. Can you give me a ride to the next town?" I hesitated. Every instinct told me to say no, to keep driving. But she looked so desperate, so human. Finally, I unlocked the door. "Climb in." She slid into the passenger seat and shut the door behind her. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. I thought no one would stop. As I pulled back onto the road, I tried to make conversation. "What were you doing out here so late?" She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant, like she was remembering something from long ago. "I was going home." Her answer didn't make sense, but I didn't press her. Something about her presence made the cab feel colder. She smelled faintly of roses, but there was another scent beneath it, something metallic, like blood. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye. Her dress was spotless, too clean for someone who'd been walking in the desert. The unease grew heavier with each passing mile. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Her reflection wasn't there. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. "What are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The woman turned to me, her face no longer soft and frightened. Her eyes were dark, hollow pits, and her mouth twisted into a cold, unnatural smile. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said, her voice no longer trembling but icy and sharp. Before I could react, the lights in the cab flickered and went out. The engine died, leaving us in total darkness. My heart pounded as I fumbled for the door handle, desperate to get out. But when I turned to look at her again, she was gone. I sat there in the silence, too terrified to move. The headlights flickered back on, illuminating the empty road ahead. The engine roared to life on its own, and I floored the gas, not daring to look back. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. I've heard stories from other truckers about ghosts on the road, about people who stop for hitchhikers that disappear without a trace. Maybe it was one of those legends, or maybe it was something worse. All I know is if you're ever driving down Route 66 and see mile marker 203, do yourself a favor, keep driving, don't stop, don't look back. As I sped away from mile marker 203, my hands trembled on the wheel. The truck's engine groaned as I pushed it harder than I should have, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get as far away from that place as possible. The desert stretched endlessly in front of me, its emptiness swallowing the faint glow of my headlights. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see her standing in the middle of the road, watching me. But there was nothing. The silence in the cab felt heavier than before, pressing on my chest. I reached for the radio, hoping the sound of static might drown out the fear clawing at my mind. But when I turned it on, it wasn't static. Instead, her voice came through again, clear and calm this time. "You can't run from me," she said. My blood turned to ice. I slammed the radio off, but the voice didn't stop. It echoed inside the cab, as if it were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't have stopped," she whispered. "But it doesn't matter. You can't leave." I shouted, "Leave me alone." My voice sounded small, weak, like a child trying to scare away the monsters under their bed. But there was no answer this time, just silence. Suddenly, the truck shuddered violently, as if I'd hit something. The wheel jerked in my hands, and I fought to keep control as the tires screeched against the pavement. The headlights flickered again, and for a brief moment, I thought they were going to go out completely. When they stabilized, I saw something that made my heart stop. The road in front of me wasn't empty anymore. Figures lined the shoulder on both sides, pale and still, like statues carved from marble. Men, women, even children, they all stood motionless, their faces turned toward the truck. Their eyes were dark and empty, just like hers. They didn't move as I passed, but I could feel their gazes following me, burning into my skin. I pressed harder on the gas, trying to put as much distance between me and them as possible. But no matter how fast I drove, the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, the figures multiplying, their numbers growing with each mile. I was trapped in a nightmare, and there was no waking up. Then, out of nowhere, the cab filled with a deafening screech, a sound like metal grinding against metal. It was so loud I had to cover my ears, the wheel swerving dangerously under my knees. The sound tore through me, shaking the truck as if something massive was clawing at its sides. I screamed, "What do you want from me?" The noise stopped as suddenly as it started. The truck steadied itself, and for a moment, there was nothing but the hum of the engine and my ragged breathing. I thought maybe it was over, that I'd somehow escaped. But then I saw her again. She was standing in the middle of the road, directly in my path, her white dress glowing faintly in the darkness. Her face was calm now, almost serene, but her eyes burned with something I couldn't understand. I hit the brakes, but it was too late. The truck roared forward, and I braced for the impact. Except there wasn't one. The truck passed right through her, and for a moment everything went black. The headlights, the dash, the road, everything disappeared. I felt like I was falling, tumbling through an endless void. Her voice surrounded me, soft and mocking. "You can't escape," she said. "This road doesn't end, not for you." When the lights came back on, I was no longer on Route 66. The road beneath my tires was cracked and broken, the asphalt giving way to jagged dirt and rocks. The desert around me was gone, replaced by a dense, suffocating fog that swallowed everything more than a few feet away. The figures were back, standing just beyond the edge of the headlights. They didn't move, but I could feel them watching, waiting. I don't know how long I drove through that fog. It could have been minutes or hours or days. Time didn't seem to exist anymore. The fuel gauge didn't move, and the clock on the dash was frozen at 3:03 a.m. I tried turning the truck around, but no matter which direction I went, the road stayed the same. The worst part was the whispers. They started soft at first, just faint murmurs at the edge of hearing. But they grew louder with each passing mile, until the cab was filled with overlapping voices, all speaking at once. Some were angry, others pleading, but all of them were relentless. "Why didn't you save me? You stopped for her, but not for me. It's your fault. You'll never leave." I screamed at them to stop, but they only laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that seemed to come from everywhere. I slammed my fists against the wheel, tears streaming down my face. I didn't understand what was happening or why it was happening to me. I just wanted it to end. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fog lifted. The road beneath me smoothed out, and the familiar desert landscape returned. The clock on the dash started ticking again, and the fuel gauge dropped a little, as if no time had passed at all. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw her sitting in the back seat, her dark eyes staring at me. She smiled. "You'll never leave," she whispered. I slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the truck, running as far and as fast as I could. When I finally collapsed on the side of the road, gasping for breath, I turned to look back. The truck was gone. The road was empty. I never went back to driving after that night. I sold my rig, moved to a small town, and got a job far away from the highways. But sometimes, late at night, I hear her voice. And when I do, I don't dare look out the window. Because I know she's still out there, waiting for me to come back. I was hauling frozen goods across Wyoming that night, a route I'd taken dozens of times before. The load was perishable, and the deadline was tight. So, I decided to push through the night, despite the warnings of a storm rolling in. The forecast had called for snow, but I'd driven through worse. The highway was quiet, and the radio chatter was sparse, just the way I liked it. It was close to midnight when I noticed the first sign of trouble. My GPS glitched for a moment, the map flickering before rerouting me down a side road. I frowned. I knew the highway like the back of my hand, and this detour didn't make sense. But the voice on the GPS was insistent, urging me to take the next exit. The turnoff led me onto a narrow, two-lane road that wound through a dense forest. Snow had started to fall, soft at first, but quickly thickening into heavy flakes that made it hard to see. I cursed under my breath, gripping the wheel tighter. There were no other vehicles, no streetlights, just the beam of my headlights cutting through the storm. About 10 miles down the road, I saw a sign for a rest area up ahead. It was an old, rusted thing, barely legible, Black Hollow rest stop, 2 miles. I didn't remember ever seeing it on this route before, but the snow was coming down hard now, and I needed a break. I figured I'd pull over, grab a coffee, and wait for the storm to ease up. The rest stop appeared suddenly, almost like it had materialized out of the storm. It wasn't much, just a single building with a flickering neon sign that read "Open." The parking lot was empty except for a few abandoned cars, their windows frosted over. I pulled my rig into the lot and killed the engine, the silence settling heavily around me. Inside, the rest stop was eerily quiet. The air was stale, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The layout was typical: a small diner counter to the right, a few rows of tables and chairs, and a convenience store section in the back. But there was no one behind the counter, no other travelers, no sound of a TV or radio. Just me and the hum of the lights. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly. No answer. I walked over to the counter where a coffee pot sat on a burner, half full and steaming. Next to it was a plate of donuts, stale-looking but untouched. It felt strange, like someone had just been here but left in a hurry. I poured myself a cup of coffee and took a sip, wincing at the bitterness. That's when I noticed the clock on the wall. It wasn't moving. The hands were frozen at 12:03. I checked my watch, but the screen was blank. My phone, too. No signal, no time, nothing. A deep unease settled over me, but I told myself it was just the storm messing with things. I decided to grab a snack from the convenience store section and get back on the road. The aisles were narrow and poorly lit, the shelves lined with items that looked off. The packaging was faded, the logos unfamiliar, and the expiration dates were years out of date. I picked up a can of soda, but the label was smeared, the words unreadable. A chill ran down my spine, and I set it back down, deciding I'd had enough of this place. As I turned to leave, I heard a sound, a faint scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. It came from the far end of the store, near the restrooms. "Hello?" I called again, my voice shaky this time. The scraping stopped. I took a hesitant step toward the sound, my boots crunching softly on the worn tile floor. The restroom door was slightly ajar, the light inside flickering. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get back in my truck and drive as far as I could. But something pulled me forward, a morbid curiosity I couldn't shake. I pushed the door open slowly. The restroom was empty, 2 stalls, a sink, and a cracked mirror. The light above flickered weakly, casting strange shadows on the walls. The scraping noise came again, louder this time, but it wasn't coming from the restroom. It was coming from the storage room just beyond it. Heart pounding, I stepped into the hallway that led to the storage room. The door was slightly open, a sliver of darkness visible beyond it. I reached out, pushing it open with a trembling hand. Inside, the room was filled with boxes and shelves covered in dust, and in the middle of the floor was a figure, hunched over and dragging something across the ground. It was a man, or at least it had been. His clothes were tattered, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. He moved in jerky, unnatural motions, his head snapping up to look at me as I stepped inside. His eyes, they weren't human, they were black, empty voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. His mouth twisted into a grin, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice a guttural growl that made my stomach churn. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut and running for the exit. My boots slid on the icy tile as I sprinted through the diner, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, I heard the sound of footsteps, quick, uneven, and getting closer. I burst through the front door and scrambled into my truck, locking the doors and starting the engine. The headlights cut through the storm, revealing the parking lot, and the figure now standing at its edge. He didn't move, just stood there, grinning as I threw the truck into gear and tore out of the lot. The storm seemed to let up as I sped back toward the highway, the snow thinning until the road was clear again. I didn't stop until I saw the familiar glow of another rest stop, this one filled with trucks and travelers. I pulled in, shaking and exhausted, and parked beside another rig. When I went inside, the place was warm and bustling with life. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, and the coffee was fresh. I told myself it was just a bad dream, a trick of the storm. But as I sat down and tried to collect myself, I noticed something in my pocket, a receipt. It was faded and smudged, but I could still make out the name at the top, Black Hollow Rest Stop. And beneath it, written in shaky handwriting, were 3 words, "You'll be back." The coffee shop at the second rest stop was bustling with truckers, travelers, and the hum of life, but my mind couldn't shake what had just happened. I sat in a booth in the corner, gripping the cup of coffee so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The receipt from Black Hollow Rest Stop lay on the table in front of me, staring up like a mocking reminder. I tried to convince myself it was all just stress. Maybe I was more exhausted than I thought. Maybe the storm had played tricks on my mind. But the memory of those black eyes and that crooked smile was too vivid to ignore. And then there was the receipt, the undeniable proof that I'd been there, even though I knew for a fact that rest stop wasn't supposed to exist. As I sat there, one of the other truckers approached. He was a burly man with a salt and pepper beard and a trucker cap that looked as old as the road itself. He slid into the booth across from me without asking, his piercing blue eyes studying me. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. I hesitated, unsure if I should tell him, but something about the way he looked at me told me he'd seen his fair share of strange things. Finally, I spoke. "Have you ever heard of Black Hollow Rest Stop?" His face changed instantly. The color drained from his cheeks and his hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. "Where'd you hear that name?" he asked, his voice low. I swallowed hard. "I was just there." It wasn't normal. The man leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Listen to me, kid. You didn't stop there, did you?" I nodded slowly, watching as he let out a string of curses under his breath. He looked around the diner as if expecting someone or something to be watching. "That place ain't on any map," he said finally. "It shows up for folks who don't listen to their gut, who take the wrong turn at the wrong time. I've heard stories, people who stopped there and never came back. If you're lucky, you leave with just your mind playing tricks on you. If you're not. He didn't finish the sentence, but his expression said enough. I leaned closer, desperate for answers. Why? What is it? What's wrong with that place? He shook his head. No one knows for sure. Some say it's a gateway, a place between worlds. Others say it's cursed land, where the lost linger and pull others into their hell. Whatever it is, you're damn lucky to have gotten out. Before I could press him further, he stood abruptly. If I were you, I'd stay off the road for a while. Let the storm pass and keep that receipt close. Don't throw it away. Why not? I asked, my voice shaking. Because it's their way of marking you, he said, already walking away. And if they want you back, they'll find you. I couldn't get his words out of my head as I left the diner and returned to my truck. The storm had cleared and the highway stretched out before me, dark but familiar. I tried to focus on the road ahead, telling myself it was over. I'd escaped. But as the miles passed, a nagging feeling began to creep in, the sensation that I wasn't alone. The first sign came about an hour later. The headlights of my truck flickered, dimming for just a moment before returning to full brightness. I chalked it up to electrical interference, but then the radio came to life, even though I hadn't touched it. Static crackled through the speakers, followed by faint, distorted whispers. I reached out to turn it off, but before I could, a voice broke through. Come back. It was a woman's voice, soft and haunting, the same one I'd heard at the rest stop. My heart pounded as I yanked the dial, silencing the radio. But the voice didn't stop. It seemed to fill the cab, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Come back to us, it whispered. You're one of us now. I slammed the brakes, pulling the truck to the side of the road. The silence that followed was deafening. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I scanned the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those black eyes staring back at me. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind me. I climbed out of the truck, needing a moment to breathe. The cold night air bit at my skin, but it did little to calm my nerves. The highway was silent, the only sound the faint rustle of the wind. I told myself it was just my imagination, the lingering effects of a bad experience. But when I turned to get back into the truck, I froze. The receipt was sitting on the dashboard. I could have sworn I'd left it in the diner, but there it was, the faint, smeared writing staring back at me. And beneath the words, Black Hollow Rest Stop, was something new. Scrawled in shaky handwriting, see you soon. The rest of the drive was a blur. I pushed the truck to its limits, speeding down the highway in a desperate attempt to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was out there. When I finally reached the drop-off point, I barely remembered unhooking the trailer or signing the paperwork. All I wanted was to get out of that truck and never look back. I quit trucking the next day, sold the rig, packed up my things, and moved to a small apartment in the city where I thought I'd be safe. For a while, I was. Life went back to normal, or as normal as it could be after what I'd seen. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The first reminder came a few months later. I found the receipt in my coat pocket, even though I was sure I'd thrown it away. The words "see you soon" were still there, clearer now, as if freshly written. I burned it in my sink, watching the paper curl and blacken until it was nothing but ash. But 2 days later, it was back, sitting on my nightstand as if it had never been touched. The whispers started again after that, soft at first, barely audible. They came at night, just as I was about to fall asleep. Come back, they'd say, growing louder with each passing night. You belong with... I don't know how much longer I can fight it. The nightmares are getting worse, and the whispers don't stop, even during the day. Sometimes I see shadows moving in the corner of my eye, shapes that vanish when I turn to look. And sometimes, when I pass a mirror, I see black eyes staring back at me. I know it's only a matter of time before they come for me. And when they do, I don't think I'll be able to resist. If you ever find yourself on the road and see a rest stop that wasn't there before, do yourself a favor, keep driving. Don't stop, don't look back. Because once you go to Black Hollow Rest Stop, you never really leave. Trucking has always been a lonely job. Long nights, empty highways, and stretches of silence that could make even the strongest mind start to wander. But it was the solitude I liked. The quiet gave me time to think, and the open road felt like freedom. That all changed one cold autumn night on Highway 50, the loneliest road in America. I was hauling a load of furniture from Reno to Kansas City, taking a route I'd driven a dozen times before. The moon was high, its pale light washing over the barren desert, and the stars stretched endlessly across the sky. The road ahead was empty, not another vehicle in sight. It was just me, the hum of my engine, and the occasional crackle of the CB radio. It was sometime after 2 a.m. when I saw her. A figure standing on the side of the road, her silhouette illuminated by the glow of my headlights. She was wearing a long coat, her dark hair blowing in the wind. I slowed down instinctively. Hitchhikers weren't unusual on these roads, and though I rarely picked anyone up, something about her made me hesitate. As I got closer, she turned to face me. Her eyes caught the light, reflecting it like a cat's in the dark, and for a brief moment I thought about speeding past. But she looked young, no older than 20, and she was standing there all alone in the middle of nowhere. My better judgment lost to the thought of leaving her out there. I pulled over, the hiss of the brakes cutting through the silence. Rolling down the passenger window, I leaned over. "You need a ride?" I asked. She didn't answer right away, just stood there, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Then she nodded slowly, her movements deliberate, almost mechanical. Without a word, she climbed into the truck, her coat rustling as she settled into the seat. "Where you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "East," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's where I'm going," I replied, pulling back onto the road. "You're lucky I came by. Not a lot of folks drive this stretch at night." She didn't respond, just stared straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her face was pale, almost ghostly in the dim light of the cab, and her eyes, something about her eyes made me uneasy. They were dark, almost too dark, like deep pools of ink. I tried to make small talk, but she didn't say much, just gave short, one-word answers or nodded. After a while, I gave up and let the silence settle between us. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, the road disappearing into the horizon. About an hour passed before I noticed something strange. The radio, which I always kept on for background noise, started to crackle with static. I reached over to adjust the dial, but no matter what station I tried, the static remained. Then faintly, beneath the crackling, I heard something, a voice. It was faint, barely audible, but it sent a chill down my spine. "Stop the truck." I glanced at the girl. She was still staring straight ahead, her face emotionless. "Did you say something?" She turned to me then, her eyes locking onto mine. "You need to stop the truck," she said, her voice flat, almost robotic. I felt a knot of unease tighten in my stomach. "Why? We're in the middle of nowhere." "There's something ahead," she said, her tone unchanging. I looked back at the road, but all I saw was empty asphalt stretching into the distance. "I don't see anything," I said, my grip tightening on the wheel. "Please," she whispered. "Stop the truck." Something in her voice made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Against my better judgment, I eased off the gas and pulled over to the side of the road. The engine rumbled softly as we came to a stop, the headlights cutting through the darkness. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaky. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the door handle and stepped out of the truck. I watched as she walked a few feet down the road, her figure barely visible in the moonlight. For a moment, she just stood there, staring into the distance. Then she turned back to me, her face pale and expressionless. "They're coming," she said. "Who's coming?" I asked, my voice rising. But before she could answer, I saw them, shapes emerging from the darkness, moving slowly but deliberately toward the truck. At first, I thought they were people, maybe a group of hikers or stranded travelers. But as they got closer, I realized something was wrong. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like puppets on tangled strings. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the headlights, and their faces. Their faces were wrong, distorted, stretched, like they'd been molded from clay and left unfinished. I threw the truck into gear, my heart pounding in my chest. "Get in," I shouted. The girl didn't move. She just stood there, watching as the figures drew closer. "You can't run from them," she said softly. "The hell I can't!" I yelled, slamming on the gas. The truck roared forward, the tires kicking up gravel, as I sped back onto the highway. In the rearview mirror, I saw the figures stop at the edge of the road, their heads turning to follow the truck as it sped away. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then I realized the girl was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the door closed as if she'd never been there. My chest tightened, and I gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and the moon hung high in the sky, cold and indifferent. I didn't stop driving until dawn, When I finally reached a truck stop on the edge of a small town, I stumbled inside, my hands shaking, and ordered a coffee. The cashier gave me a strange look as I fumbled with my wallet. "You okay, man?" he asked. "Yeah," I lied, my voice hollow. "Just a long night." As I sat down with my coffee, I overheard two truckers at the next table talking. One of them mentioned Highway 50 and my ears perked up. "Strangest thing," the older one said. "There's a story about a hitchhiker out there. They say if you pick her up, you'll see things. Things that ain't meant to be seen." "What happens if you don't pick her up?" the other asked. The older man shrugged. "Don't know. But the ones who do, well, they say she disappears before the end of the ride. And if you see her again, you're already dead." My stomach dropped, and I stared into my coffee, my mind racing. I never told anyone about that night, but I've avoided Highway 50 ever since. Every now and then, though, I hear stories. Truckers talking about a girl standing by the side of the road. And every time, I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for her next ride.